Today on Iwo Jima, we're going around to a few caves and stuff and such like that. So right now we just found one that was in the boonies. We just came across it.
Deadly artillery and mortar fire greeted the Marines as they moved forward.
In 1945, American Marines made a discovery beneath Iwo Jima that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They could hear them, Japanese soldiers, whispering, moving, breathing, somewhere beneath their feet. See, what the Americans didn't know was that the island they were standing on was hollow, 11 miles of tunnels, over 1,500 hidden chambers, an entire underground city carved into volcanic rock, filled with thousands of soldiers who had sworn a single oath, killed 10 Americans before dying. And when the Marines finally went down into that darkness, what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. Booby-trapped passageways designed to kill intruders. Underground hospitals where surgeons operated by lantern light. Chambers filled with soldiers who had chosen mass suicide over surrender. Some of the stories were so disturbing that veterans refused to speak about them for decades. By the end of this video, you'll understand why what American troops discovered in those tunnels still shocks historians to this day. At first glance, Iwo Jima looked like nothing special, just a tiny volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Barely 8 square miles of jagged rock and sulfur fumes. Most people couldn't even point to it on a map. It seemed like the last place on Earth where anyone would want to fight and die. But here's why both Japan were willing to sacrifice thousands of lives for this speck of land. Location. Iwo Jima sat roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo, directly in the flight path of American B-29 bombers headed for the Japanese mainland.
At 11:02 a.m., the B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki.
For Japan, the island served as a critical early warning system. Radar operators stationed there could give Tokyo hours of advance notice before bombs fell. Japanese fighter planes could scramble to intercept incoming aircraft long before they reached their targets. For America, capturing Iwo Jima meant something else entirely.
The flash radiation of heat from the blast scorched hillsides as far as 8,000 feet away from ground zero.
It meant eliminating that warning system once and for all. It meant gaining emergency airstrips where crippled bombers could land instead of crashing into the Pacific. Thousands of American air crews would owe their lives to whoever controlled that island. So both sides understood the stakes. This wasn't just another island. This was the key to winning the war in the Pacific. Now, the geography of Iwo Jima was a nightmare all on its own. Mount Kuribayashi, a dormant volcano, rose 550 feet at the southern tip of the island like a giant watchtower. Whoever controlled that mountain controlled everything.
The Marines had trained for this day for thousands of hours. When they hit the beach, their training took over.
The beaches, the approaches, every square inch of ground below. The rest of the island was a twisted moonscape of ridges, ravines, and rocky terraces. And the beaches were made of fine black volcanic ash that swallowed men ankle-deep the moment they stepped onto it. Marines who landed there couldn't run. They could barely walk. Tanks got stuck. Vehicles spun their treads uselessly in the soft ground. Every inch of terrain seemed specifically designed to kill invaders. But here's what the Americans didn't realize. The real danger wasn't on the surface at all. It was underneath. In mid-1944, Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima with orders to hold the island at all costs.
So much was symbolized in that ship, a whole national effort to build.
But Kuribayashi was different from other Japanese commanders. He studied previous battles where Japanese forces had launched suicidal banzai charges straight into American machine guns and concluded that those tactics were insane. Brave, certainly, but strategically useless. All those charges accomplished was getting Japanese soldiers killed faster. So Kuribayashi came up with a different plan, a better plan. He would turn the entire island into an underground fortress. His engineers began carving tunnels into the volcanic rock, connecting artillery positions, sniper nests, and pillboxes into a massive hidden network. The work went on for months. Soldiers dug by hand in the sweltering heat, hollowing out chambers and passageways deep beneath the surface. By the time the battle began, they had excavated more than 11 miles of tunnels, linking over 1,500 separate chambers and bunkers. And here's the genius part. These tunnels were completely invisible from above. Camouflage doors blended seamlessly into the surrounding rock. Ventilation shafts were disguised as natural cracks in the ground. Multiple exits connected to each position, allowing defenders to disappear from one location and reappear somewhere else entirely. Marines would assault a pillbox, pour grenades and flamethrower fuel inside, and assume they had destroyed it. Then 10 minutes later, they would get ambushed by defenders who had slipped through a hidden tunnel and reoccupied the exact same position. Deep underground, Kuribayashi built command centers equipped with communications equipment, ammunition storage rooms that could supply his forces for months, and hospitals where wounded soldiers could be operated on by lantern light, far from American bombs and artillery. One massive bunker was buried nearly 90 feet beneath the surface. It could house hundreds of men and was so well constructed that even direct hits from the largest naval guns couldn't penetrate its rock ceiling. For weeks before the invasion, American planes and battleships hammered Iwo Jima with one of the heaviest bombardments of the entire Pacific War. Thousands of tons of explosives rained down on the island. When it was finally over, American commanders assumed the defenders had been annihilated. Nothing could have survived that kind of punishment. They were completely wrong. Kuribayashi had simply ordered his men to wait it out underground. While bombs exploded harmlessly on the surface above, his soldiers sat in their tunnels, untouched, checking their weapons, preparing for battle. The Japanese weren't dead. They were ready and waiting to unleash hell. The Americans were about to walk right into the most sophisticated death trap of the entire war. February 19th, 1945. The first waves of Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima, expecting a brutal fight from the moment they landed. What they got instead was something far more unsettling: silence. For the first 30 minutes, resistance was surprisingly light. Scattered gunfire here and there, a few mortar rounds landing in the sand. Nothing like the storm of steel they had prepared themselves for. Many of the men started to relax just a little. Maybe the bombardment had actually worked. Maybe the Japanese defenders were already dead. That was exactly what Kuribayashi wanted them to think. See, the silence was the first weapon. Kuribayashi had given his men strict orders. Hold your fire. Wait. Let the beaches fill up with American troops. Let them bring their equipment ashore. Let them pack together in the soft, volcanic ash where they couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't take cover. And then he gave the signal. Artillery and mortars erupted from hidden positions all across the island. Mount Suribachi lit up with muzzle flashes. The northern ridges exploded with pre-sighted shells that had been aimed at specific points on the beaches months in advance. Every gun had been zeroed in on killing zones. The Americans had walked directly into a carefully planned slaughter. Marines sank ankle-deep in the black sand, unable to run, unable to find cover. Entire landing zones got raked with overlapping fields of machine gun fire. Men who had been joking with their buddies seconds earlier were suddenly dead. The beach became chaos. From that moment forward, the battle became unlike anything the Marines had ever experienced in the Pacific. The Japanese fought like ghosts. Snipers would fire from a cave entrance, vanish into the tunnels below, and reappear hundreds of yards away to fire again. Marines would clear a pillbox, move forward, and then get shot in the back from the same position they had just destroyed. The defenders were using their tunnel network to circle behind American lines, appearing where they were least expected. And at night, things got significantly worse. Small teams of Japanese soldiers would crawl out of hidden tunnel exits after dark. They would creep silently into American positions and toss grenades into foxholes where exhausted Marines were trying to sleep. Some of them whispered taunts in broken English just to keep their enemies awake and terrified. No one could sleep. No one felt safe. Every shadow was a potential threat. Every cave mouth was a potential death trap. Every moment of quiet might be the calm before another attack. Kuribayashi had issued a single order to every man under his command: kill 10 Americans before you die. That order transformed the tunnels of Iwo Jima into killing grounds where fear itself became one of the most effective weapons. Marines started calling their enemy ghosts, because that's exactly what it felt like. Fighting something that could appear anywhere without warning, strike from impossible angles, and then vanish back into the earth before anyone could respond. The Americans quickly realized a terrible truth. They weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting the island itself. And if they wanted to take Iwo Jima, they would have to go underground. At first, the Marines tried everything they could think of to avoid entering the tunnels. They knew what was down there: hidden soldiers waiting in ambush, grenades, mines, tripwires, death traps designed to kill anyone who entered. So instead of going in, they tried to seal the entrances permanently. Bulldozers pushed rocks and debris over cave mouths. Engineers planted explosives to collapse passageways. Flamethrower teams poured burning fuel into the darkness. The flamethrower operators had perhaps the most dangerous job on the entire island. The moment they ignited their weapons, they became priority targets. Japanese snipers specifically hunted them because they knew how devastating the flamethrowers were. Most operators measured their survival in minutes, not hours, but they kept going anyway because burning out the tunnels seemed like the only way to clear them. At least, that's what the Americans thought. The problem was, it wasn't working. The tunnel network was simply too extensive, too interconnected, too well designed. Marines would seal one entrance, and the defenders would just use another. They would burn out a cave, wait for the flames and smoke to clear, and then watch Japanese soldiers emerge from a completely different opening 50 yards away. The tunnels made the enemy impossible to pin down. Eventually, the Marines had no choice left. They had to go down into the tunnels themselves. Volunteers crawled into passageways barely wide enough for a single man to squeeze through. They carried flashlights, pistols, and whatever courage they could muster. Some of those tunnels extended for hundreds of feet into complete darkness. Others opened suddenly into massive underground chambers. All of them were potential death traps. The heat was suffocating. Volcanic rock held warmth like an oven, turning the tunnels into sweltering hell. The air was thick, stale, and hard to breathe, and every single step forward was a gamble with death. Tripwires connected to grenades, pressure plates linked to hidden explosives, charges buried inside the walls themselves that could bring the entire ceiling crashing down in an instant. Marines advancing cautiously through the tunnels would sometimes enter what appeared to be an empty room, only to hear a quiet scrape behind them. A defender emerging from a concealed crawl space they hadn't even noticed. In that kind of close combat, there was no time to think, no time to aim carefully. It was pure survival. But what they discovered inside those underground chambers was even more disturbing than the fighting itself. The Japanese had built an entire world beneath the surface. Command posts, lined with tactical maps still showing detailed battle plans. Storage rooms stacked from floor to ceiling with ammunition and supplies. Living quarters where soldiers had slept on mats in the permanent darkness. And hospitals. Marines stumbled into underground medical stations where wounded Japanese soldiers lay in eerie silence. The smell of medicine and antiseptic mixed with something else, something worse, the smell of infection and approaching death. Some of the Japanese medics raised their hands in surrender when the Americans appeared. Others clutched grenades tightly to their chests and pulled the pins, choosing to die alongside their patients rather than allow themselves to be captured. In other chambers, the Marines found the terrible aftermath of mass suicides. Bodies lying carefully side by side. Rifles stacked neatly against the stone walls. Men who had pressed grenades to their own heads or cut their bellies with bayonets rather than surrender to the enemy. One Marine later described it as stumbling into a tomb where death had been deliberately and carefully arranged, and scattered throughout the chambers were personal effects that complicated everything. Family photographs, handwritten letters from home, good luck flags covered with farewell messages from wives, children, and elderly parents. For a brief moment, the Marines saw their enemy as something other than targets. They saw fathers, brothers, sons, men who had been trapped in an impossible situation and had chosen to die rather than dishonor their families by surrendering. But there was no time for sentiment or reflection. Every chamber was still a potential ambush site. Every object might be a booby trap designed to kill anyone who touched it. The deeper they went, the more the Marines understood what these tunnels really were. They weren't just defensive positions. They were shrines built specifically for sacrifice. Underground temples where men had come to die. As the battle dragged on week after brutal week, the situation inside the tunnels grew increasingly desperate. Japanese soldiers who had survived the initial fighting found themselves cut off from supplies and reinforcements, surrounded on all sides, trapped in suffocating darkness with dwindling food and water, while American forces closed in from every direction above and below. For most of them, there were only two choices remaining: surrender, which their commanders had branded as the ultimate disgrace, a shame so profound it would taint their families for generations, or death with honor. Most chose death. In chamber after chamber, Marines found the grim evidence. Bodies clustered around empty ration cans and canteens. Soldiers who had slowly starved in the darkness rather than give themselves up. Others had pulled the pins on grenades in their final moments, leaving behind blackened walls and shattered remains. Some had gathered in groups for ritual suicide, using bayonets on themselves in the traditional manner of their warrior ancestors. The scale of it was absolutely staggering. Out of more than 20,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, only a few hundred were taken alive as prisoners. The rest died in the tunnels, in the caves, in sealed chambers that became their permanent tombs. Marines who survived the battle later admitted that they eventually came to fear silence more than gunfire. A quiet tunnel often meant that somewhere deeper inside, a group of soldiers was preparing to detonate explosives and kill themselves, along with anyone who entered. General Kuribayashi himself is believed to have died this way. His body was never positively identified despite extensive searches. Some historical accounts suggest he led one final desperate attack against American positions in the closing days of the battle. Others say he took his own life in a sealed command chamber, buried forever with the men he had led. To this day, his exact fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of Iwo Jima. But here's what made these suicides even more haunting to the Americans who witnessed them. The Japanese defenders didn't just die. They died absolutely convinced they were protecting their homeland, their families, everything they had ever loved. Wartime propaganda had told them that surrender meant torture, humiliation, and eternal shame for their entire family line. So they chose death instead, willingly, even eagerly. Marines who entered those final chambers weren't just witnessing the aftermath of combat. They were seeing the result of an ideology that placed honor above life itself. Every tunnel became a potential grave. Every room held the possibility of encountering men who had made their absolute last stand. And even after the Battle of Iwo Jima officially ended, the tunnels still refused to give up their secrets, because incredibly, some of those soldiers were still alive. The Battle of Iwo Jima officially ended in late March 1945. But the tunnels didn't get that message. American troops who remained stationed on the island after the main fighting ended started reporting increasingly strange occurrences. Unexplained noises at night, muffled voices echoing from somewhere deep underground, footsteps in tunnels that had supposedly been sealed. Sometimes they even detected smoke seeping through cracks in the volcanic rock. At first, commanding officers assumed it was just combat stress, nerves, overactive imagination, trauma from everything these men had witnessed. But it wasn't imagination. Small groups of Japanese soldiers had actually survived underground, hiding in the deepest chambers where American forces hadn't yet reached. They lived on carefully rationed stored food and collected rainwater, waiting for a rescue operation that would never come, waiting for news that Japan had won the war. Some of them held out for years. The last two known holdouts didn't surrender until 1949, 4 full years after Japan's official defeat and surrender. When they finally emerged from the darkness, they were described as gaunt and half-feral. Men who had spent years living in total darkness, completely convinced the war was still being fought somewhere above their heads. Rumors spread among the troops about entire units that had been entombed alive when engineers sealed caves with explosives during the battle. Marines whispered about ghostly figures seen wandering the black sand beaches at night. Japanese military personnel stationed on the island decades later reported hearing phantom footsteps or disembodied voices calling their names from empty tunnels. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the sense of presence on Iwo Jima is undeniable. Veterans who returned for memorial ceremonies decades later described walking past sealed cave entrances and feeling a physical weight pressing outward. Some couldn't bring themselves to approach the tunnel mouths, knowing what memories waited inside. One Marine who helped raise the first American flag on Mount Suribachi later said that fighting on Iwo Jima was like battling ghosts. The enemy came out of the ground, vanished back into the ground, and the ground itself seemed alive with malevolent intent. Another veteran, who participated in mop-up operations after the main battle, described venturing into tunnels during those final days. He said it was the silence that stayed with him forever. Every single time he went underground for the rest of his life, whether into a mine or a basement or a subway station, he had nightmares about Iwo Jima. Japanese survivors who eventually told their stories described their own version of that underground hell. One man recalled that he lost all sense of glory in those tunnels, the unbearable heat, the maddening thirst, the constant fear, the sound of flamethrower fuel dripping through cracks in the ceiling above his head. He spent weeks in darkness, simply waiting to die. But there were also moments of humanity amid the horror. Japanese-American interpreters approached cave entrances completely unarmed, speaking in Japanese to convince terrified soldiers to surrender peacefully. One of them would remove his shirt to prove he carried no concealed weapon, calling out that they didn't have to die, that they could live. Dozens of men who had been utterly convinced that Americans would torture them emerged alive because of his courage and patience. Today, nearly 80 years after the battle ended, the tunnels of Iwo Jima are still there. Many entrances have collapsed from age and weather. Others are deliberately sealed. Some are far too unstable and dangerous to explore. But military historians believe miles of passageways remain intact deep underground, filled with unexploded ordnance, rusting weapons, and the undiscovered remains of soldiers who never came home. Japanese recovery teams still return to the island, carefully extracting bones from the darkness. Thousands of remains have been brought back to families over the decades, but as many as 10,000 men are believed to remain buried in collapsed chambers, their final resting places unknown. Offerings are left at cave mouths, bottles of water, sake, tributes to soldiers who died of thirst in the dark. The island itself has become sacred ground. Civilians are not permitted to live there. Access is restricted to military personnel and memorial visits. But beneath the surface, the labyrinth waits, silent, dangerous, heavy with memory. General Kuribayashi's body was never found. His sword and personal effects may still lie buried somewhere in those tunnels. Historians have dreamed of discovering sealed chambers filled with wartime relics, but the danger of unexploded bombs and collapsing rock has kept most of the tunnel system unexplored. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. The tunnels aren't just relics, they're monuments to what happens when men are pushed beyond every limit of endurance, when honor becomes more important than survival, when an entire army chooses death over surrender. For those who walked into that darkness in 1945, the tunnels of Iwo Jima never truly let them go. And maybe that's the point. Some places hold on to the people who passed through them. Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how many years pass. Some ghosts, whether you believe in them or not, never really leave. The tunnels of Iwo Jima are still there beneath the black volcanic sand, still waiting, still silent, and still haunted by everything that happened inside them.